Hi, and welcome to Beyond the Label, a new series dedicated to discussing all things, well, beyond the label. My name is Chris Orr, and I'm the Global Director of Sales Engineering at Siegel Scientific, the makers of BarTender software. Now, people don't give a lot of thought into the amount of work and ingenuity behind the design, management, and printing of a label. Well, we take them for granted. They are everywhere, though. Pick up nearly any object made by a person and there's some sort of marking on it. Take this watch band that I got from Amazon, right? There's a barcode on that. Or this bottle of vitamins from GNC. They've got their own code on there. They've got their own information on their labels. Or in a particularly meta situation, on this book about barcodes, there is a barcode. Most of the items around you generally have some sort of barcode or QR code. I mean, like this can of Mountain Dew. There's the standard sort of barcode there as well as a QR code on there. Behind each of the markings, text or symbol, is a story to be told, and future episodes of this series will dive deeper into them and answering all sorts of questions, like today's episode, who invented the barcode and why? Or there will be topics like, what is GS1? Or how does RFID work? And what is this Amazon transparency thing I keep seeing on things that I order online? So, why did we decide to launch the series today? Because it's National Barcode Day. It's a little known fact that today is the 50th anniversary of the first barcode scan. Seriously, it's hard to believe in this day and age that there once was a time when barcodes were not as pervasive as they are today, or that people once believed that putting barcodes on items was a way for greedy corporations to rip off the consumer and hide prices. To begin our story, though, the history of the barcode is tightly entwined with the history of retail and labels themselves. Hundreds of years ago, the very first labels were put in books by their owners. In the 1600s, some of the first trade goods with labels were bottles of Dom Perignon. For the next 300 years or so, there are maybe incremental changes like the addition of logos, ingredients, colors, etc. But the basic premise doesn't really change, even though the number of items that have labels has increased exponentially, which leads to the major problem that shopkeepers and grocers had in the early to mid-1900s. The sheer growth in the number of products available in a store was wonderful from the standpoint of the consumer because of all of the choices that they had. But it rapidly became terrible for the cashier because they had to key in by hand every item and their price. This, of course, leads to long lines of shoppers. At some point, complaints were made, and one of them was overheard by a fellow named Bernard Silver, and he told one of his friends. This is Norman Joseph Woodland, inventor. In 1947, as a result of his conversation with Silver, he began to ponder the problem. Interestingly enough, he called upon his upbringing with the Boy Scouts and thought about Morse code and how it might apply to the issue at hand. How did he arrive at his solution? Well, in a scene not that far removed from the classic back of the napkin story, he was sitting at the beach thinking about Morse code and the dots and the dashes. He stuck his fingers in the sand to emulate the dots, but then he drew his fingers towards him, making lines. Hence, the first barcode. Unfortunately, he then thought that a circular pattern would be better because he imagined that a circle could be read from any direction and angle. Silver and Woodland filed their patent for a circular barcode, which was granted in 1952, but apparently they lacked the technology to make it work perfectly. They experimented with the brightest lights available at the time and even ultraviolet light, but nothing really worked very well. So, the idea sits idle until 1966. By now, the laser had been invented, and while most companies thought of laser technology as leading to things like death rays, the first practical applications were much more mundane. Again, complaints about how long it took for people to check out at a grocery store, in this case, Kroger, and complaints were made. They needed a way to improve the speed of their cashiers. But it was another 6 years before RCA could develop a solution using lasers and Woodland's circular barcode in 1972. Unfortunately, the technology was expensive and bulky, so wide adoption was not possible. Besides the expense and bulkiness of the technology, resistance also came from the manufacturers, who had their own ways of identifying their products, and the work to change their packaging was too difficult. And coming up with a standard way of labeling that did not interfere with somebody else's methods was difficult. Which, by the way, the development of the UPC, or Universal Product Code, will be a topic in and of itself in the future, so stay tuned for that. At the time, the ad hoc committee of the Universal Product Identification Code was tasked with finding some way to have a common system of marking and identifying products. At the time, RCA thought that they were a shoo-in. But a last-minute pitch by IBM and an employee named George Laurer, a member of the team that had been assembled, came up with the final version that we recognize today. Weirdly enough, Norman Woodland himself also worked at IBM at the time, but had nothing to do with the work that Laurer and his team had made until much later. And by the way, when I say pitch, I mean it literally. To test the speed and accuracy of the scanner, someone threw a pack of cigarettes with a barcode label printed on it across the scanner, which was then read correctly. Apparently it cost the thrower 3 bottles of Jack Daniels. So it came down to RCA's circular symbol system and IBM's rectangular barcode in 1973. It took a review by scientists at MIT to determine that IBM's was the better technology. Thus, the stage is set, a dream is voiced, and ideas developed, and technology is invented. What you see before you is the very first product with a barcode that was scanned in a grocery store. A 10-pack of juicy fruit was scanned at a Marsh supermarket in Troy, Ohio. This particular item was selected because no one thought that you could get a readable barcode on such a small package. But every story has a villain. Meet Carol Tucker Foreman. In the 1970s, she led a group called the Consumer Federation of America, and up until this point, just about every item in a grocery store had its own individual price label on it. And she felt that barcodes were a way for companies to hide prices from the consumer, and the system would be rife with abuse. The CFA's argument all boiled down to a simple premise. Item-level pricing was better for the consumer than shelf-level pricing. Think about it. When you go to most markets now, there is pretty much nothing on the item to show how much it costs. These days, we are now trained to look at the edge of the shelf itself for some indication of the price. But of course, even today, that largely assumes that the item is in the correct place on the shelf and that the price there is accurate. For years, there was a debate over whether or not federal legislation would be needed around this matter, and between the reluctance of the manufacturers and lobbying by the CFA and Tucker Foreman, adoption of the new barcode labeling and scanning technology was very slow. It wasn't until Tucker Foreman left the CFA to become the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Agriculture that barcodes began gaining traction again in the 1980s. Even then, it took until 2004 before the number of companies in the top 500 in the U.S. using barcodes hit between 80 and 90%, 30 years after its development. Well, since the birth of the concept, hundreds of types of barcodes have been developed. You can typically find 2 classes of barcodes. 1D, which looks like the traditional barcode that we all know and love, and 2D, which have been in development since the 1990s. Now, outside of the label industry, all of the normies call them QR codes, as I did earlier in this episode. Of course, BarTender software can handle all of these, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it at least once. What does all of this mean? Well, barcodes aren't the only things on a label. Besides the barcode, a label has many different parts, and future episodes will explore these things, like what do these symbols mean, and why do some labels need warning messages, or there are 3 different kinds of barcodes on this label. What do they all mean, and how do they help this package get to the right place? Why are there so many barcode types? Is it safe to even scan a QR code? It's madness, I tell you. Just kidding. There are many things to explore in the world of barcodes and labels, and well, we can discover those things together as we continue to go beyond the label. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, please feel free to comment or share them with us. Thank you. Stick around and I'll see you on the other side of the label.